pleasure of meeting. I am Sarah Colson, the 22nd Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. As many of you may know, our organization was formed in 1853 by a group of patriotic women who at the time, which was pre-Civil War, and as an aside, had neither the right to vote nor own property, quite improbably managed to raise the funds necessary to purchase Mount Vernon when neither the Congress nor the state of Virginia were willing or able to do so. And thus, they saved Mount Vernon from ruin. The history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is a wonderfully inspiring one, born of determination and a unifying love and admiration of George Washington. However, it is not the story we're here for this evening. So before we introduce Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist Rick Atkinson, I first must acknowledge the Robert H. and Clarice Smith Family Foundation, who have been so generous throughout our history, including tonight's lecture series, which they established in honor of their daughter, Michelle Smith. I would also especially like to thank each of you here tonight, not only for your generous support of this program, but for all you do to help us with our incredible educational and historic preservation work, not just here at Mount Vernon, but truly across the globe. And lastly, as I think about the history, the 160-year plus history of the association, there are two women here tonight who loom very large in our modern accomplishments. From the dream and determined execution of the exciting, and I say flourishing, Fred B. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, to our essential quest to protect Washington's view across the Potomac, I dare say we would not have been as successful as we were it not for the leadership and dedication of these two women. And I would like to introduce Regent number 18, Gay Gaines. And my predecessor, Regent 21, Barbara Lucas. Gay, Barbara, and Ben, thank you for coming. It's wonderful to be with you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mount Vernon's President and CEO, Doug Bradburn, who will introduce Rick Atkinson. We all know Doug very well, but I should say that in his brief 6.5-year tenure thus far, he is making his mark in so many areas of the estate. First, as the founding director of the incredible George Washington Library, and more recently by accepting the role in becoming our 12th president and CEO. Doug also is a respected historian, as well as a vibrant, inspiring leader. And he's a terrific person to partner with as the Ladies Association seeks to forever protect Mount Vernon and educate the world of George Washington's incomparable legacy. Doug, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Regent. I'm honored to be here tonight with you, and of course the past regents. Both of you are very, very important to my position here. I mean, Gay Gaines was the big powerhouse behind the fundraising that built the library, of which I was the founding director, carried that incredible vision through its completion. And Barbara Lucas was my regent for the first years I was here as well, and she was such a great partner to work with as we were trying to develop the library. So it's great to see you all here tonight amongst all these wonderful friends. And I should also thank the Robert and Clarice Smith Family Foundation for their support and their ongoing support. I also want to mention that we have here with us tonight, I think in the overflow room, so they can't stand up and be recognized, but we have a great group of rising college juniors from all over the country, our Mount Vernon Leadership Fellows program, who come to Mount Vernon for 6 weeks to learn the lessons of leadership of George Washington and carry on his legacy as the future leaders of this country. And I'm delighted to say they're here tonight in the other room with us. So if you hear anything over there, it's them. Now, we've had an extraordinary series already this year. You'll remember, of course, we began with Nick Bunker's masterful telling of the early years of Benjamin Franklin, followed by Nat Philbrick's brilliant new study of the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown. And now we're really coming to a high note in the series. A crescendo, really, is going to happen tonight, and I'm so excited for you. I'm going to jump out of my shoes as I talk about what we're about to experience, because we're going to hear from Rick Atkinson lecturing on his brand new book, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. Now, if you don't know Rick Atkinson's previous work, you really are in for a special treat tonight. He is, as Mrs. Colson said, an award-winning journalist, having a successful and long career at the Washington Post, and he's a world-renowned author and military historian. He's the author of many books, including The Long Gray Line, a narrative saga about the West Point class of 1966, Crusade, a narrative history of the Persian Gulf War, In the Company of Soldiers, an account of his time with the 101st Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And of course, he also wrote the acclaimed Liberation Trilogy, 3 studies of the American War in the European theater. An Army at Dawn, the war in North Africa, 1942 to 1943, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. And in fact, I think he received notice of winning that prize while he was embedded with the 101st in Iraq. The Day of Battle, the second in the trilogy, the war in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 44, which is called, quote, a triumph of narrative history, elegantly written and rooted in the sights and sounds of battle. And finally, The Guns at Last Light, the war in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945, which completed the story of the American theater in Europe and completed what was really a truly monumental achievement in American letters that will go down as one of the great histories of World War II. Now, he's known in his writing for his ability to mix the detail and statistics with the telling quotation, to help recount the experiences, the mindset and passions of the everyday soldier, equally with the sense of grand strategy. And everywhere is a rejection of romance in his writing. It is universally celebrated as vivid, rich, complex, elegant, evocative, powerful. But it's not just the quality of the writing which distinguishes him, I think. It's really his storytelling which sets him apart from the pack. He writes books that you can't put down. They are gripping in the full sense of the word. They grab you and they don't let go of you until you finish. Atkinson is the recipient of the 1982 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting, the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, and the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for History. Extraordinary. He's the winner of the 1989 George Polk Award for National Reporting, the 2003 Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award, the 2007 Gerald R. Ford Award for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense, the 2010 Pritzker Military Library Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. They gave that to him too early, 2010 Lifetime Achievement. You still got more work to do, Rick. The 2013 New York Military Affairs Symposium Award for Lifetime Achievement, 2014 Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for Lifetime Achievement from the Society of Military History. In December 2015, he received the Peggy V. Helmrich Distinguished Author Award, and he served as the General Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership of the U.S. Army War College. He is a presidential counselor at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, an inductee in the Academy of Achievement, for which he serves as a board member, and he serves on the governing commission of the National Portrait Gallery. So, his bona fides are established tonight. He is, in short, the greatest living American writer on war. And I think, his gifts to us, in addition to the incredible books he's written, the gifts are even more palpable today, the day after Memorial Day. Because here we are on the day after Memorial Day, and his work does incredible service to our society's weak and fleeting historical memory. History is the conscience of any nation, and he helps Americans remember the sacrifices of so many who now long forgotten, men and women who've served and died so that we could live in peace and freedom. And we thank him for that writing. And now it is my great pleasure to say that he's turned his remarkable talents to retelling the story of the American War for Independence, one of the greatest stories in human history, the origin story of our great nation. And what more timely subject could there be right now? We're so quick right now to divide each other up into different groups, different identities, and try to talk about the different stories that we all have, when in fact we share so many things. And we need great storytellers to remind us and ground us in our shared history, a history which tells us who we are, what values we share, inspires us to great achievements in our time. George Washington called the United States a great experiment. It's an experiment we're all still embarked upon. He called it the last great experiment in human happiness under civil society. And that experiment began with a bloody war, the last argument of George III. And so Rick Atkinson is going to be the great historian of our generation who retells that struggle in this trilogy of books, which corresponds, of course, with the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States. So you are really lucky to have him here tonight. The book is just out. And so we are there at the beginning of the retelling of the greatest story in our nation's history. He's joined tonight by his lovely partner in life, his wife, Dr. Jane Chestnut Atkinson, who's a researcher and clinician at the National Institutes of Health. Welcome tonight. And let's all give a big Mount Vernon welcome to Rick Atkinson to take the stage.
Thank you, Doug. On Friday afternoon, I flew home to Washington from Dallas, and as the plane banked over the Potomac for the final approach into Reagan National, off the left wing, we had a beautiful view of this estate, the famous portico, the red roof contrasting with the white mansion and its famous cupola, the bowling green, the neat outbuildings. The young woman in the window seat in front of me turned to her boyfriend and said with a big smile, "There's Monticello." I swear on the Washington's graves it happened. Still work to be done, Doug. Curse you, Thomas Jefferson, you branding genius. I went to high school about 5 miles north of here, back when the Washingtons were still in residence on the estate. And in truth, it must be said that Mount Vernon in the past half-century has grown tremendously in stature, interpretive clout, and sheer fun. Doug, you and your team are doing terrific work, and you've been great friends and partners to me. Thank you. Thank you. He mentioned, I worked in the newspaper business for years, including a long stint at the Washington Post as a reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent, but I began to have doubts about my career choice when one day someone told me the story of the world's first brain transplant. The doctor went in to see the patient the night before the procedure and said, "Congratulations, sir, you're about to have the world's first brain transplant, and you have a choice as to the kind of brain you can receive. You can have the brain of a military officer. That'll cost you $100 an ounce. You can have the brain of a professor of history. That will cost you $200 an ounce. Or you can have the brain of a journalist, but that will cost you $1,000 an ounce." The patient said, $1,000 an ounce? That's outrageous. Why is it so expensive? The doctor said, "Do you have any idea how many journalists it takes to get an ounce of brain?" They're not enemies of the people. They have their issues. At any rate, so I became a military historian, only $500 or $600 an ounce. And I spent 15 years, as Doug mentioned, writing a trilogy about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II. And in 2013, as I finished that third and final volume, I began pondering what to do next. The obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific and do for that campaign what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western Europe. But that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a personal fascination with a different war in a different century, a fascination I've had since I was a kid living just down the road. Well, I've now completed Volume 1, as Doug mentioned, and what I hope will be another trilogy, knock wood. The British Are Coming opens with an extended prologue in June 1773, when King George III travels to Portsmouth on the south coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a fantastic, proud display of military muscle precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire with victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we call it. 1773 is the year the phrase, The Sun Never Sets on the British Empire was coined. And this volume ends with the two battles at Trenton and then the Battle of Princeton in January 1777, when it resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished. Now, it may be rude to criticize a man in his own house, but let me suggest that there is a lot to dislike about the Founding Fathers and the war they waged for independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves, 1 in 5 of all souls who occupied the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776, nor was it valid for Native Americans, women, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even fence straddlers skeptical of armed rebellion, were subjected to dreadful treatment: public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine where they were lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams later admitted, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemy in the contest." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, the Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by negotiation and blandishment, a 14th colony. This was the first but hardly the last American invasion of another land under the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab a musket on behalf of freedom is mostly mythical. During the Revolution, General Washington's army was rarely larger than 20,000 troops and at times dwindled to 3,000 in a country of 2.5 million people, particularly after the initial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill faded in 1775. Relatively few American men volunteered for military service, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and too often badly led American army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and thrilling? Even in 2019, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, that story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans died for the cause, and possibly many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to die in any conflict other than the Civil War. So what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? Well, first, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but, as the Declaration of Independence insists, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with acumen, grit, wisdom, and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils before. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot permit it to be taken away. we cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values and conflicting visions of the future world. The Americans eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Certainly the rebels could be wrong-headed in believing that they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, for example, or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imaginations and even tonight is mincing across the stage in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. One, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of inciting a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower, would intimidate the obstreperous and eventually restore harmony. And three, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Ireland, Canada, the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel America into Vietnam 2 centuries later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. General Kelly could attest to that. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from English and Irish ports. But of 40 transports dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 ships arrived directly in Boston. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain, or blown to the West Indies, or intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep carried aboard ships that actually made it to Boston, that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the voyage across the North Atlantic. Only 40 of those 550 arrived alive. Of 290 hogs shipped, just 74 arrived alive. Most of the 5,200 barrels of flour in one shipment proved to be rancid. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776 and requested 950 horses to pull their artillery carriages and supply wagons, 412 of the 950 horses died at sea during the voyage from Britain. Scores more were ruined beyond use. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. I've personally seen just how hard in Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf in the Revolution, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February 1776, half mentioned munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, especially gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead. And by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of the stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets, clocks, and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Beef required even more. Before the war, America imported 15 million bushels of salt annually, half from the West Indies and half from Britain and Southern Europe. But the British trade embargo, once the shooting started, strangled 2/3 of those imports. Profiteers and hoarders drove up the prices from 2 shillings a bushel to eventually 75 shillings a bushel by late summer of 1777. To encourage salt works along the coast, pamphlets were printed with recipes for salt making. Congress authorized handsome bounties for every bushel created. All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote, but 400 gallons of seawater were needed to boil off a single bushel of salt, and that required enormous stacks of firewood. Virginia spent more than 6,000 pounds, a huge sum in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay, but collected a total of 50 bushels. It's probably the most expensive salt in the world. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. And those rats soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles, the daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat. A gill is about 5 ounces. It's a gallon of rum a month per soldier. Took an enormous amount of shipping space. The British Navy Board needed 400 transports and victualling ships to move and supply the large force in New York. It's triple the tonnage used at the peak of the 7 Years' War. Let me talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owns, as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers from all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from the reign of George III, most of them previously unpublished. And I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 at Windsor Castle, where the papers are stored. Every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate and show it again at the Norman Tower, then climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. He had become king in 1760 at the age of 22. And he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, he also made the copies. And as you paw through these pages, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad between 1764 and 1775. Lists of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards. Lists of all his regiments in America with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margins as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup. Write this down. Rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. And insecticide, wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He was an ardent theater goer, and he kept critical notes on performances, writing that one actor, for instance, had a formal gravity in his mien and a piercing eye. He had married an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville. Charlotte learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage to England from Germany. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish. Nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity. Eventually to number 15, and we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing is usually intimate, at very close range, face to face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 50 yards and usually hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 or so actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. Battlefield wisdom held that it took a man's weight in bullets to kill him. And in Revolutionary War combat, that's not far wrong. On the other hand, massed musket fire by clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs flying downrange at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall had an exterior surface of 2,550 square inches, of which 1,000 were exposed to gunfire when he was facing an enemy frontally at close range. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which was hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hit in the head, the odds of surviving are even worse. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, especially those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but more difficult to load and they couldn't carry a bayonet, those marksmen learned to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. In the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare. But what of the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of more than a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic, far less ironic and less skeptical than in their worldview than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own argot idiom, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes referred to Americans derisively as Jonathans. But these are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, and sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months because he was part of the force besieging the British at Boston, when she wrote him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt and take great pleasure doing it, she told him, and keep faith with the future. She signed her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." General Nathanael Greene makes one of the worst operational decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American soldiers exposed and vulnerable at Fort Washington on Manhattan, where in the space of 8 hours in November 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. This is during a period when American generalship is often characterized by miscalculation, misfortune, imprudence, and deficient military skills. But Greene picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and writes to Cati, his wife, "The virtue of the Americans is put to trial. I am hardy and well amidst all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best." Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, to you, and he's certainly speaking to me. The sheer drama of the revolution keeps it compelling and often stunning, from the bloodletting at Bunker Hill, where 1 of every 8 British soldiers killed during the Long War would die in 4 hours, to the skin of the teeth escape by Washington and his army in the fog across the East River in August 1776 after a terrible drubbing on Long Island. And beyond the battlefield, the theatrical power and pathos of the conflict surely outruns any dramatist's imagination. The abrupt arrival of the septuagenarian Benjamin Franklin in Paris to woo the French absolute monarchy into an alliance with radical Republicans. The 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America from 1775 to 1782. Those white men sitting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, lashing at horseflies with their handkerchiefs while carving up Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration to make it shorter and much better. The many American families, Ben Franklin's among them, ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences. If the central figures in our creation story have frequently been embalmed in reverence, they nonetheless remain beguiling, worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Let's talk about him for a minute. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died here in 1799. You cannot square that moral circle. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander at Long Island, Fort Washington, and on other battlefields. That's not surprising when he took command of what was generously called the Army of the United Colonies outside Boston in July 1775. He'd had 5 years of experience in the Virginia militia, but he'd been out of the soldiering business for 17 years. He knew little about cavalry, artillery, how to supply an army, or how to organize a continental force. He faced a steep learning curve, and it was made all the more daunting by the fact that, except for a couple of aides, Washington had almost no staff in those early months. He was the staff. Quartermaster, clothier general, muster master general, ordnance officer, personnel chief, provost marshal, spy master. Those 5 years early in his life as an officer within a British military organization during the French and Indian War had imprinted him with some of the 18th century British social distance between superiors and subordinates, officers and enlisted. It took him a while to figure out that there is a mystical bond between leaders and led, particularly within a democratic political construct. When he first became commander-in-chief, Washington had difficulty appreciating the great sacrifice being made by the average soldier in leaving his farm, his shop, his family to serve the cause. He complained bitterly about dirty New Englanders. He had almost nothing good to say about the junior officers who joined his army when he first became commander. And Washington, of course, was an immensely wealthy man with overseers and all those slaves to keep this place going in his absence. It would take the shared experience of hardship, sacrifice, many failures, occasional successes, and the common pursuit of a common goal to forge unbreakable links between superior and subordinate. Through 8 years of the Revolution, he rarely, not never, but rarely, showed real brilliance as a tactical or operational commander. He tended not to see the battlefield spatially and temporally the way great captains do, like Napoleon. So on a number of occasions during the Revolution, we see him making mistakes or being saved from his mistakes by subordinates. For example, he favored a frontal assault on entrenched British positions in occupied Boston, which would have been a calamity. His generals, almost to a man, said, "No, no, no." He'd been a surveyor as a young man, of course, and he had a surveyor's eye for ground, for terrain. But on Long Island, in August 1776, he failed to adequately examine the ground to conduct reconnaissance, and that failing contributed to a catastrophic defeat. He was slow to evacuate New York, partly for political reasons, partly because he misread the battlefield. And as long as we're piling on, the man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. He didn't disabuse Congress that it was his idea to seize Dorchester Heights, the high ground overlooking Boston, which proved key to forcing the British to abandon the city. In truth, the idea was more or less forced on him by subordinates. And while he accepted responsibility for the capture of Fort Washington, he claimed, quite untruthfully, that he hadn't had time to really assess the American position there. In 1776, we find him carping about his troops, his officers, his lot in life. "I distrust everything," he complained. And those complaints transform our demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. So what does he have going for him? Well, quite a lot, of course. Let's start with the attribute that Napoleon would most cherish in his generals. Anybody know what it is? Height? No, not height. Good guess. Yeah, chutzpah? Yeah, chutzpah. No, luck. Luck. It shouldn't be underestimated in life. It should never be underestimated in war. Washington is lucky. When he decides out of desperation to cross the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, to attack the Hessian garrison in Trenton, you've heard of that, and when he then decides to double down and a few days later crosses the Delaware again for what turns out to be the victorious battle at Princeton, he displays boldness and a good grasp of his intelligence, meticulous preparation, and an ability to adapt as conditions change, but he himself refers to, quote, 2 lucky strokes at Trenton and Princeton. By this time, he'd demonstrated a gift for improvisation and the deft escape, an ability to grab the occasion by the forelock, as one British historian put it. He's durable and robust. 43 years old when he takes command in 1775. For the subsequent 8 years of war, he shows an iron constitution. He never seems to even catch cold. That's important. He shows a willingness to listen to advice, to learn from his mistakes, and he shows a keen eye for subordinate military talent, recognizing, for example, that an overweight, bow-legged Boston bookseller 25 years old, named Henry Knox, had enough of a gift for gunnery to become the father of American artillery. Or that an obscure Quaker anchorsmith from Rhode Island named Nathaniel Greene will be one of the greatest generals in American history. It's up to him, to Washington, to be the chief strategist, military strategist for these new United States. There are no Joint Chiefs, no Secretary of Defense, no National Security Council. He has to figure out how to defeat the British Empire, which, among other things, has the greatest fleet the world has ever seen. He realizes, first and foremost, that he doesn't actually have to win the war, but rather he has to avoid losing it. And he learns painfully that you don't have to win every battle to win the war, and in fact, trying to win every battle can cause you to lose the war. He's a gifted political general, matched in American history only perhaps by Dwight Eisenhower, with whom I spent, metaphorically, 15 years. And we're not talking about partisan politics, of course, but rather political in the sense of instinctively knowing how to motivate both subordinates and superiors, how to maneuver, how to inspire, how to compromise. What a concept. In the first month after being appointed commander-in-chief in June 1775, Washington writes 7 letters to Congress, his political masters. In each of those letters, he acknowledges, either overtly or tacitly, civilian control of the military. It's an extraordinary gift that he gave to us at that time and subsequently. An extraordinary portion of his correspondence during the war is to governors, congressional committees, provincial committees of safety, influential movers and shakers. This not only signals his steadfast devotion to civilian control of the military, it's a fraught subject in the 18th century. They're very aware of Oliver Cromwell's history. But it also helps to influence policy, to accumulate allies, to have friends when you need them. He also learns some bitter lessons, that war is rarely linear. It prefers a path of fits and starts, ups and downs, triumphs and cataclysms, that only battle can reveal those with the necessary dark heart for killing, years of killing, that only those with the requisite stamina, aptitude, and yes, luck, will be able to see it through. And finally, the hardest of war's hard truths, that for a new nation to live, young men must die, often alone, usually in pain, and sometimes to no obvious purpose. He, more than anyone, will be responsible during the Revolution for ordering those men to their deaths. He embodies Republican values, small r. Of course he has insecurities, and he's ambitious and preoccupied with his reputation. But he recognizes that there must be a moral core at the center of the great enterprise he commands, knowing that immoral behavior is a slippery slope in war as in life. He's constantly reminding his soldiers to behave, in part because he knows that a civil war, and the Revolution is our first civil war, is about hearts and minds, and that soldier behavior is critical to winning that battle. Great responsibility enlarges him. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interests to a greater good, as well as other virtues, dignity, humility, determination, moral stamina, incorruptibility, traits that should remain true north for every citizen today. His faith gave others faith. His strength made others strong. And finally, he develops a shrewd understanding of the ornery, independent peoples known collectively as Americans. In January 1777, Washington wrote, "A people unused to restraint must be led. They will not be drove." He was a leader, and how lucky we are. Lesser personalities, largely lost to history, speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. Heaven only knows what may be my fate, Captain John McPherson wrote in a last letter to his father before being killed at Quebec. I experienced no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it. Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote his wife, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, your father was a coward." He too died at Quebec. Even Benedict Arnold, perhaps the finest battle captain on either side early in the war before his subsequent missteps, wrote after being shot in the leg in Canada, "I am in the way of duty and I know no fear." Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Schy, who taught at the University of Michigan for eons, wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war because every war is about young men and sometimes women dying young. My ambition has been to find that emotional grip, as Professor Schy put it, to revive the tragic, human, multi-sided quality that saturates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull, a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat toward Boston, captured by the Americans, in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel. He lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse before he too takes heaven by the way. Or we see Mary Pierce, the widow of a private killed at Bunker Hill while fighting with the Massachusetts militia, as she petitions the Commonwealth for precisely £5 and 12 shillings in compensation for her husband's lost coat, trousers, stockings, shoes, buckles, silk handkerchief, knife, and tobacco box. Or General Richard Montgomery in the assault on Quebec, hit by grape shot in both thighs and mortally through the face. His effects were auctioned off to his officers a couple days after his death, item by item. 2 volumes of Polybius, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, a buffalo skin and clothes brush bought by Captain Aaron Burr, and a wardrobe that included ruffled shirts, holland waistcoats, and a pair of tea-tongs, all purchased by Benedict Arnold. Or we see Île aux Noix, the island of nuts, a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell, half of them suffering from smallpox, dysentery, typhus, or some other god-awful malady, infested with lice and maggots. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept till I had not more power to weep." And we see Matthew Patton of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Île aux Noix. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." Historian Bruce Caton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy. Surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. "The cause of America," wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, "is the cause of all mankind." Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2019. Who do we want to be? Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish told us. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is dynamic, never a thing done, something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring, the creation of the American Republic, among mankind's most remarkable achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly swatting men asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks so much for having me here tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for that. And you students in the other room, wake up. All right, we've got time for questions, I believe, and there are folks on both sides with microphones, and they will find you and they will give you a microphone.
I've sort of asked this question of a couple of your other speakers, but I never get quite the answer I'm looking for. Washington starts out the war wanting to draw the British into a climactic battle and win it. At Boston, at Long Island, to some degree at Harlem Heights. A short time later, he is into asymmetrical, almost guerrilla war, to draw them inland, to wear them down, and so forth and so on. What do you attribute that change in his basic focus of, and the term you used, I thought you nailed it, was he needed to not lose the war. They couldn't win the war, but he just needed not to lose it. What caused that transition?
Getting his butt kicked repeatedly is what caused it. I mean, he recognized, first of all, he's very aggressive. He's really, he is natively an aggressive commander. He is looking to mix it up. Sometimes when we look at the alabaster portraits of him, I think we underestimate the extent to which he really is, aggression is part and parcel of his makeup. But he realizes, you know, you could argue somewhat belatedly, particularly after the defeat on Long Island, that he just doesn't have the wherewithal to go toe-to-toe in the kind of climactic battle, as you put it, that he would perhaps like to fight. He also realizes that the British, having experienced Bunker Hill, General Howe was there, he walks up the hill every member of his staff, General Howe's staff, is killed or wounded. Howe comes back down unscathed, but covered in blood. And Washington knows that it's unlikely that the British are going to make that same mistake twice in the sort of frontal assault on entrenched positions. And so he comes to the realization that he's got to fight a different kind of war, that it's, he talks about a war of posts in which you pick your spots. And he's always looking for the main chance. He's always looking for the opportunity to fall on the British and on his terms fight them in a Donnybrook. But those opportunities are pretty rare. And, on the few occasions when they do happen, things don't go right. No plan survives contact with the enemy, and that's true in the Revolution as it's true in every other war. So he realizes that in order to win the war, he's going to have to lay back. He's going to have to be smart. He's going to have to fight essentially a defensive war, all the time looking for his chances. He finds that chance, I mentioned it earlier, at Trenton twice, in Princeton, where he falls in the garrison and almost 1,000 Hessians are killed or captured, and that's fine, but it's not the kind of slugfest that he's hoping for. And so over the course of 8 years, he's going to have to fight the kind of war that's imposed on him by the conditions that he finds, not the conditions that he hopes for, not with the army that he would like to have and the supplies that he would like to have, but with the army he's actually got and the supplies that he's actually got. So, one of the things that is most admirable about his generalship, he may not be Napoleon the way he sees a battlefield, but he's got a strategic sense of, first of all, he needs to not lose the war. He knows the British have to win the war, that they're at the end of a very long supply tether, that British public opinion is a fragile thing, he hopes. Turns out not to be as fragile as you might think, takes 8 years, but that if he can drag it out, if he can bleed them here and there, nicks and cuts and British soldiers bleeding, that he cannot lose the war and therefore eventually win it. I think it's quite a remarkable realization by him, and it's a tribute to the fact that he really has some chops as a general. Now you can say to the next speaker, I've asked the three last.
Is one of his failures not realizing that he cannot hold New York, he cannot retake New York? Because even in 1780, when he's trying to get Rochambeau and then the French fleet to help him retake New York, he has to have some push to go to Virginia and Yorktown.
Yeah, I mean, New York is a grudge match for him. He's held it initially partly because Congress, dithering a bit, and Congress is Congress, wants him to hold New York. They're reluctant to give it up, and so he's holding on to it. He eventually realizes with nudges from Greene, incidentally, is sick at the Battle of Long Island. The defensive plan has been Nathaniel Greene's, and he's in his sickbed when it comes time to actually execute it, and that's one reason why it's executed so poorly. But when Greene gets out of his sickbed, he helps to persuade Washington that the position in New York in 1776 is untenable. You don't have to be a military genius to know that New York is built on an archipelago, and there's 800 miles of shoreline, and whoever controls the waterways around New York has an enormous advantage. And Washington writes about the fact that they've got this advantage. So when he finally is persuaded that Manhattan Island, first of all, is not going to be his for long, and he makes the mistake of affirming Greene's decision to leave the garrison at Fort Washington, but that's when he begins to the process of being ejected from New York. And it clearly sticks in his craw for years he's looking for an opportunity to take it back. It's a pivot in the whole colonial construct. And if he can get back New York in 1780, that's going to make the British hold on the 13 colonies generally very, very difficult. It's been their headquarters for 4 years at that point. But he needs, again, to be kind of general. There's a better opportunity waiting for you in the South. And it turns out there's a better opportunity waiting for him in the South. It's called Yorktown. And, again, to his credit, he's not a stubborn fool. He's not, I am the commander-in-chief, don't tell me what I should think. He listens to it, looks at the maps, thinks it through, and makes a decision. Can't ask for more than that in a commander-in-chief. I think that's what's happening when, in that interval between 1776 and 1780. A lot happens then to him, but I think all the time New York is in the back of his mind. They're passing the baton. Sir.
Thank you for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. It sounds like prior to the Revolution or during the early days, the Loyalists and the Patriots there was very little civility and there was a lot of violence. We know a similar situation occurred prior to the Civil War. And it sort of feels like we're in that same position right now. How do we get out of where we are now without having another war?
Well, that's depressing. Let's talk about Loyalists for just a moment. John Adams said long after the war that about a third of the American population during the war were Loyalists, and about a third were either indifferent or they just wanted to stay out of the way, and a third were rebels, patriots. That's been misinterpreted, what Adams actually said, and that's clearly wrong. Modern scholarship indicates that of the 2 million white Americans in the 13 colonies when the insurrection begins, probably 18 to 20% are loyalists. Now, loyalism is a shifting concept. You might be loyal when the British Army's in your backyard, but when they leave and your neighbors come over and stick a finger in your chest and tell you that you're going to go to jail, you may be less loyal to the crown at that point. So there's a lot of that, and that's not uncommon in an insurgency. But 18 to 20% is not sufficient, as it turns out, and not nearly the percentage that the king and his ministers believe. It's not sufficient to tilt the cause in favor of the British. They cannot rally in sufficient numbers and provide the human terrain, to use a term Petraeus uses all the time, is very complex in America in the 1770s. And the notion that there will be enough of a silent majority of loyalists able to rally to the British cause when the army shows up proves to be a pipe dream in almost all cases. And so consequently, one of the things that the patriots, let's call them the patriots, doesn't imply moral superiority, are doing is to try to suppress the loyalists to the extent they can with the kinds of measures that I mentioned, including some really nasty measures. You're right. I mean, there were parallels to the Civil War. I don't think the parallels to today, I hope it's not to that point. Again, I think that historically we have been at loggerheads often. And we've had serious political disagreements. And we've been nasty to each other. What does it take to right the ship and getting us all pulling the rope in the same direction? I think a catastrophe, actually. Civil war. Hopefully not a civil war, but a war, a calamity of some sort. That has tended to be our national trajectory. Take World War II, a war that I know very well. you know, in the late 1930s and really into the early 1940s, the country is badly divided over what to do. And there are bad feelings toward those who want to do something that's different from what you want to do. And there's a strong sense of isolationism. And there's a reluctance to get involved in another European war. And you know, the feelings run high and they run hot, and they're hard feelings. And what does it take to get us out of that? Well, it takes Pearl Harbor and 291,000 battle deaths and 400,000 American dead over the course of World War II to feel like we're all pulling the rope in the same direction. Now, I hope that that's not the case. You know, I think one thing that would be helpful is to have a leader who can unify us. When you see him or her, you let me know. That's not a partisan statement. That's an observation. You know, it's hard to be optimistic about things today, but on the other hand, I think it's wrong to be excessively pessimistic. One reason to study our history not only is to acknowledge those who've come before us, but it's to feel that we've found our way before. We know how to get ourselves out of jams. We are very, very inventive, and we are extremely capable when we put our minds to it. And, you know, I have faith in the future. I have faith in my children's future. And when we lose that, then we're really in trouble. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
There have been, even here, we've had lots of speakers on their histories of the revolution and how they approach it. I was curious how, in your mind, you distinguish yourself from other historians who have gone at the Revolutionary War. What kinds of things you want to bring to it that perhaps previous historians have not, how you distinguish yourself in this crowd.
Yeah, it's a crowd. There have been quite a few books written about it. Not as many as World War II, I think, actually. I think Amazon has 60,000 hardback books on World War II. How do I distinguish myself from it? I'm going to leave that to you, the reader. I think, in part, that what I bring to it is a real intensity as an archive rat. The mystery of the next unopened archival box still entrances me. And I know that all great events, like all great figures in history, are bottomless, that there is more to discover, there's more to write about. People will be writing about Abraham Lincoln 500 years from now. The same is true for World War II. And so I know that there is stuff to find. I found it in the garret of the Round Tower, for example, among many other places. I fancy that I'm a writer, and that I can write a narrative that you will want to read, and that you will feel the emotional resonances in the power of the writing and the power of the story told. But again, I leave that to you. It's reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review 2 days ago. You can take a look and see what Joseph Ellis said. And he said nice things, and he's a good guy to have on your side. So it's, you know, I think that it's incumbent on anybody tackling this big subject, ground that's been well trod, to bring something to it. You have to feel that you can move the ball forward. I feel like I'm moving the ball forward. Hang on, they can't hear you in the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel as though we're preaching to the choir, though. We are here because we know some of this. We care about this. We're all invested in this. And I worry about how we get this story and your story now into the consciousness of college students and sixth graders, and because I worry, and I'd like to know that I'm wrong about this, because you seem more optimistic. I worry that if there were a catastrophe, for example, if you don't know and appreciate the uniqueness and the magnificence of the United States of America, what it means, how it was born, all of that, this unique experience, why would you defend it? Why would you put skin in the game? And have you observed, how do you feel about that? Is it
well, it's well said. Thank you. I mean, first of all, I would suggest don't just preach to the choir, preach to the unconverted. That's important. Yeah, I know you're trying. And, I was here for Revolutionary War weekend at the beginning of May, and despite threatening weather, there were thousands here, families enjoying the reenactors and doing all the other things that go on here. And it's spectacular, and it's a way to reach out to the community and a way to bring to the 21st century a sense of what the 18th century was like and a sense of what this place was like. And I think those are marvelous things to do. I mean, World War II, country of 130 million people, we had 16.1 million in uniform. Everybody had someone they loved in harm's way. Everybody had skin in the game, as you said. 324 million today. Armed forces are 2 million or so, including the reserves. Almost nobody has skin in the game. 1%. And that is potentially problematic. It's problematic for the country in terms of having a sense that we're sending our sons and daughters off to bad places, that we, in fact, have an emotional investment in our military. And it's important, I think, for our leaders, and it's important for everyday ordinary citizens to remember, not just on Memorial Day yesterday, but every day, what's at stake and what has been sacrificed. And that's part of the story that you're talking about. There's no easy answer to your good question. Why would they risk what they risk if they don't know what it is that has been given to us? Well, that's why it's really important, to insist that the schools do what the schools should be doing, that the community does what the community should be doing, that, General Kelly and I were talking about Section 60 in Arlington Cemetery, where many of our Afghan and Iraq dead are buried now. I think the next time we're thinking about foreign adventures, we should insist all 324 million people go visit Section 60 first, so that we have some sense of what's at stake. Find the bully pulpit that fits you best and preach to the unconverted. It's the Lord's work. And I don't think there's a simpler answer than that.
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your talk and the liberal way you sprinkled your talk with quotes that were both a mix of humor and inspiration. So whether it was your own, the shot heard round the world, probably missed, or others, I am in the way of duty and I know no fear. I mean, that was wonderful and noteworthy and appreciated. I'd love to know what you're working on next. If you need ideas, I have an idea for you.
Thanks. You were taking notes, weren't you? Well, I know what I'm working on next because I'm committed to, this damnable trilogy. Having been through it once before and it took me 15 years, I don't expect this one to be any less consuming. And so I'm just starting to work on the research for Volume 2, which I think will take me from early 1777, when we've left off Volume 1, probably through the Battle of Charleston, which is the spring of 1780. It's a terrible defeat for the Americans. Speaking of grudges, the British have held a grudge about Charleston since they were ejected in their efforts to take Charleston at Sullivan's Island in the summer of 1776. And there were 5,000 American soldiers who were captured at Charleston. It really looks like maybe the British cause is turning in their favor. So that'll keep me busy for quite some time. And I don't know what your idea is, but if it's really alluring, I don't want to hear about it.
Mr. Atkinson, up here.
Hi.
What I wanted to ask you is, we've had generations of military leaders that have studied at the Naval War College, the Army War College, the command staff courses at Fort Leavenworth. When they study General Washington, what are the lessons they draw from him as a military leader in terms of his successes, the qualities that he demonstrated as a general that they admire, respect, and draw from as they study?
Yeah, I was the Omar N. Bradley Chair at the Army War College a few years ago, and I could see what they were learning there during their year, and I suspect the other war colleges are the same. I spent a fair amount of time at West Point. I was with General Petraeus last week in New York. He was my interlocutor at the New York Historical Society, and we talked a bit about something related to that question. I think the foremost thing that they study, trying to speak generally about the military education system, which is very complex and not uniform, but they're looking at character. I mean, you can look at Washington's dispositions at Long Island and cluck and say, well, that was really not smart. Or you can look at Trenton and Princeton and say, boy, that was bold. He really did take the occasion by the forelock. And you can look at any one of a number of things that he is doing as a commander, but I think the things that are most enduring about him is character. And character, not only the list of virtues that I mentioned, but his relationship with his subordinates all down the line, his ability to identify subordinate talent, his operations as a political general. Petraeus would know something about that. So especially at the higher levels, you're talking about these young colonels who are going to command brigades in the case of the Army. They're looking at things that they can draw from Washington that doesn't have to do with the tactical issues that he has faced. They may be interested, and they do staff rides, and they walk the ground on some occasions. And at the Army War College, they all go to Gettysburg every year to try and draw lessons from Meade and from Lee at Gettysburg. But again, I just went on one with them in September of last year. They're kind of looking at they're at that level, you're trying to see over the horizon. You don't want your nose down in the weeds too much. You want to get some elevation in your thinking. And, when they look at Washington and look at Washington's trajectory, including those 5 early years in which he learns some things but doesn't learn other things, and a long time out of uniform. And he comes in and he makes early mistakes, and he's got some misconceptions about the men he's commanding. Those are all useful, I think, for anybody who's going to be in a position to command or to be a senior staff officer. And so I know at Carlisle, where the Army War College is, these are the kinds of things they're doing, and I suspect it's the same Montgomery, the Air War College, and the Marines, and Newport for the Navy, where you're looking for Washington to give you some inspiration about being a leader. That's the game, about being a leader. So I think it's the best I can answer that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's let Rick Atkinson know what we thought about that incredible lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay.